Good evening, everyone. It is a joy and a real pleasure to see you all here gathered tonight, because you could be at very different places. You could be at Depeche Mode playing tonight. You could be in a warm and dry house, but no. You went through rain and wind and come here to discuss the politics of knowledge. Thank you. So that is actually already an act, a political act of engaging in the creation and the contestation of knowledge. So we are already in the process and making it all meta, and I'll try to make some more meta points because I am your presenter and moderator tonight. And so yeah, this is already almost starting to become the Socratic dialogue where Plato is talking with himself. And I did not make that comparison. But anyhow, so I am Niels ten Oever, and I am one of the three co-principal investigators of the Critical Infrastructure Lab. And today I'm here to set the stage for Blayne Haggart of Brock University, Natasha Tusikov of York University, who wrote a really great book that we will discuss extensively today. And as discussants, we have Joris van Hoboken of the Institute for Information Law and Marta Morvillo of European Studies, both of the University of Amsterdam here. And this is an event organized by the Amsterdam Center for European Studies Geopolitics of Technology series and organized with the Amsterdam School for Regional and Transnational and European Studies. And of course, the Critical Infrastructure Lab. So now I have said everything that I needed to say, so I should be pretty good. We're organizing this evening because Blayne and Natasha wrote a really great book. And I thought people should know about this book, and it's a really great book. And it's also great because they made it available freely for everyone. So that's already also an engagement in this act of knowledge. But the people that will speak here tonight, so Blayne, Natasha, Joris, and Marta, are all knowledge workers in the infrastructure of knowledge that is the university. And what happens in a neoliberal university is that often researchers are built or conditioned to be their own brand, to get their own citations, to get their name as first author on everything. And that can lead to quite a harsh competition for grants, for positions. But these people, and that's why the reason why I brought them together, are really generous, open, and loyal colleagues. They did not really know or engage a lot with each other's work, but I am sure they will do so very interestingly. And they are not just loyal, generous, and open, but their work is also characterized by that approach, by building up students, by authoring with them. And when I met Blayne and Natasha in a workshop that they organized in Duisburg, and they edited this beautiful book, Power and Authority in Internet Governance, they really did everything, not just put together something in a book that they wanted to publish, but they spent so much time editing and getting everything out of every chapter, putting in so much love, and that is the politics of knowledge that we will probably have and that we want. So tonight we will have some horrible examples about tractors, agriculture, commodification, about big tech, about how cities are being reshaped, but also know that while thinking about this and being together, we are also producing knowledge. And we can do that in a way in which we would like knowledge to see produced to create a society that we want. That was it for me. So now, without further ado, let's go to Blayne and Natasha that will first introduce their book, and then we'll be back for a nice conversation about the book with the other experts, and then after that, with you. Before we go to that, there will be moments for discussion, but we will do that through questions. And let me remind you what a question is. It's a sentence, one sentence, that goes up at the end and ends in a question mark. So if you have one, prepare one, and then we can try them out later. See you all in a bit.
Hi. Well, first, thank you, Niels, for that very generous introduction. I think I can speak for Natasha as well as myself, saying that we're very happy to be here on a rainy night. Thanks to Niels for inviting us. Thanks to the Critical Infrastructure Lab and the Amsterdam Center for European Studies for hosting us in this wonderful space. And again, as Niels said, thank you for coming out on a Thursday night. When I found out that Depeche Mode was playing in town, I thought maybe I could go. I don't know. So thank you very much. This is great. So about our book. So our book, The New Knowledge, Information, Data, and the Remaking of Global Power, it represents the culmination of the last decade of Natasha's and my research. So it brings together a number of subjects such as copyright and intellectual property, which was the subject of my first book, and also governance by and through platforms, which was the subject of Natasha's first book. And over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll go over our argument in the book. And because this is an academic event, I'm going to focus, for my part, I'm going to focus on our theoretical framework. And Natasha will discuss examples that illustrate the changing nature of power in what we call the knowledge-driven society. So she'll also highlight one of our main arguments, which is that the primary objective for governments in regulating this knowledge-driven society should not be to maximize the economic utility of knowledge, but to limit its commodification in the first place, a process that we call knowledge decommodification. But we'll get to that. So the book itself is an attempt to understand and explain some strange phenomena, or at least strange to us phenomena, that have come up over the past couple of decades related to what we call knowledge governance. And so, for example, intellectual property rights have become a central part of international trade agreements, but they're still treated as a secondary issue and not analyzed the way that, say, tariffs are. You have smart city projects that are still often thought of in terms of physical infrastructure rather than in terms of data and IP. You have network products, the famous Internet of Things, that are transforming the terms of control and nature of ownership of physical goods. You have tech companies and computer scientists who are being treated as experts in every policy field. You have liberal democracies embracing total surveillance policies that in a previous era would have been more associated with totalitarian dictatorships. And on top of that, we've had one tech fad after another, from crypto to NFTs to Web3 to artificial intelligence and large language models, all of which have this promise, utopian promise of upending everything. And we argue that all of these are part of the same phenomenon related to the rising importance of the control over knowledge as a vector of power. We also argue not just that tech or data or IP has become increasingly important, but that we're witnessing a fundamental transformation in the nature of what we consider to be knowledge itself, and that this transformation is having a systemic effect on the entire global political economy. This is a world in which commodified knowledge, primarily in the form of data and intellectual property, trump other forms of knowledge and create challenges that are very similar to those that Karl Polanyi warned us about almost 80 years ago when he discussed the marketization of society. And it's also a world that a lot of policymakers aren't fully prepared for. We should say that we come from Canada, where this is 100% definitely true. I think that European lawmakers have been thinking about these issues for a long time, but even here, I don't know if the absolutely seismic nature of these changes has fully sunk in. For instance, it matters that trade negotiators continue to treat IP and data as afterthoughts in trade agreements, or that municipal officials often undervalue the importance of data governance when contemplating smart city projects. And we wrote the book for these people, so the officials and the regular citizens who all of a sudden have to make sense of a world in which things like data and IP and AI, which sound kind of very scary and esoteric to people who aren't experts in these things, they're now gaining everyday relevance. We wanted to try to explain the nature and logic of a knowledge-driven society. But first off, we should probably define our core terms, and this is something we spend a couple of chapters doing in the book. Now, a lot of times, authors and people working in this area, there's a tendency to treat the meanings of data and information and knowledge as self-evident, when in fact they're very highly contested terms that can mean different things to different people. And so we wanted to make very clear that when we're talking about information, we're defining information as phenomena around us. So think about it kind of as reality. And we define knowledge as the human-created interpretation of this phenomena. Now, because it's a human creation, it's always going to be partial at best, which means that there is power in defining and creating knowledge. And we make this distinction, which some of our philosophy of knowledge colleagues have problems with. But we make it in order to highlight a key point about data in particular, which is that data itself is not a building block of knowledge. It's a form of knowledge. And as Lisa Gittleman and others have said, there's no such thing as raw data. Raw data, the term, is an oxymoron. And what this means is that data itself is contingent. It's always contingent. It's always political, and it always reflects value judgments, and we can't get away from that. Both the control over knowledge and the definition of what constitutes knowledge are highly political, and it's this battle for control over knowledge that defines our current moment. Now, one of the goals of the book was to develop a theoretical framework to help us think through and understand the origins and workings of this knowledge-driven society. And in particular, we draw on the field of international political economy, and especially the work of three scholars in particular, Susan Strange, Robert Cox, and Karl Polanyi. Now, a lot of people writing in this area have defined our current moment in terms of specific characteristics, the digital age, the network society, surveillance capitalism, and so on. But what these all have in common is a focus on the control over knowledge and an emphasis on the actors, like, say, Google or Amazon, that play a dominant role in collecting, organizing, and disseminating the world's knowledge. And this brings us to our first theorist, so Susan Strange. Susan Strange, who last year was the 100th anniversary of her birth, she really isn't read outside of international political economy, but she really should be, because her work on structural power and how she goes about presenting it speaks directly to our current moment. Now, essentially, Strange argued that the ability to set the rules and norms under which others operate, so that's what she called structural power, was a key form of power in the global political economy. And she argued that four forms of structural power were particularly important in this regard, and these are over security, finance, production, and knowledge. From a Strangian perspective, we can understand our current moment in terms of the changing relative importance of these four structures to the pursuit of power in the global political economy. Specifically, we argue that our current moment can be understood as involving the rising dominance of what she called the knowledge structure, in which state and non-state actors associated with the control of knowledge regulation, that is, the rules and norms governing the creation, dissemination, and use of knowledge, they have pride of place in shaping the overall direction of society. It also privileges those state and non-state actors who can exert structural power over these rules and norms and who are seen to possess and control socially legitimate forms of knowledge. And in this case, by socially legitimate knowledge, I mean commodified knowledge, specifically intellectual property and data. Now, in the book, I always have to check to make sure the slides are working, but everything is working fine. In the book, we identify three main implications of the rise of the knowledge structure, and the first has to do with its transformation of political and economic policy and objectives. So one of Strange's most important insights was that structural power, say over knowledge, can be wielded not just by state actors, but also by non-state actors. And these state and non-state actors compete and cooperate with each other for the creation and exercise of structural power. Now, international political economy scholar Robert Cox, who used to teach at York University in Canada, where Natasha is based out of, he called these conglomerations of actors state-society complexes or forms of state. Now, a world in which other types of structural power, such as over security or over finance, are ascendant, they will empower different sets of actors and they will pursue different goals than ones in which another structure, in this case maybe knowledge, is dominant. And so what this implies is a changing hierarchy of actors dominated by different forms of states or these state-society complexes. The players, again, both state and non-state actors who dominate policymaking and can wield structural power. So in a financialized state, these actors would tend to be, say, finance ministries or banks, hedge funds, and the like. In a military state, it would be the military, security services, mercenaries, and those involved in providing security services. Each form has its own dominant players and primary policy objectives. In the book, we argue that today the financialized state that's been dominant for the past, let's say, 40 years or so, is being overtaken by what we call the information imperium state. Now, for the information imperium state, the dominant players are those actors that are able to exert control over commodified knowledge, such as data. And our current moment is particularly interesting and distinctive because most of these players are in the private sector, so these are our beloved tech companies. The knowledge structure, like all these other structures, has its own particular logic, which all actors, whether or not they're kind of knowledge companies or not, will tend to follow. And so the dominance of the information imperium state and the knowledge structure generally helps to explain the emergence of the platform as a dominant business model. So as Nick Srinichek points out in his still invaluable Platform Capitalism, companies in every sector are retooling themselves to maximize their ability to capture data, which they, of course, can either use themselves or sell to others. For example, as someone told me at a clean tech conference a few years ago, it used to be that the value in a sensor was in the sale of the physical sensor. That's where companies made their money. Now, the perception is that all the value is all in the data that it collects. The manufactured thing here has become a means to an end. The data is what's valuable. And that's the essence of not only the knowledge-driven society, but the transformation of one form of society, one form of state, into another. The ascendance of the knowledge structure has also reshaped public policy. So just as the financialized state prioritizes a shareholder return, the information state and the knowledge-driven society follows its own particular logic. And the logic of the knowledge-driven society is if you don't collect all the data and you don't control all the intellectual property, then you're leaving both security and or profit on the table. And that's why the surveillance problem is so hard even for liberal democracies, because in a knowledge-driven society, to limit surveillance is to limit security, it's also to limit profit. So that last part here is also a reminder that the information imperium state and the processes that we're describing, it's not just an economic phenomenon. It's about security as well as economics. There's more stuff going on here than just a straight economic reading of things. Now, the focus on power through the control of knowledge has rewritten the book, not just on security, but on economic development. So, for instance, economic development used to be manufacturing driven. In contrast, strong IP has created a world of global value chains in which profits flow to those companies that control the IP and leave everyone else, including those who actually do the work of building the things, to fight for scraps. It's a hierarchical world. And as Mark Schwartz notes in a really excellent Review of International Political Economy article, it resembles nothing so much as the franchise model popularized by that famous tech company McDonald's. It's one in which head office gets the profits, the franchisees takes the risks while having no power and getting little of the economic reward in comparison. And suffice to say, for the most part, this thinking about of winners and losers and IP and this kind of hierarchical world it is not really reflected in countries' trade negotiation strategies. Now, geopolitically, we argue that this collected-all impetus also rewires the main economic fault lines to follow two different strategies, what we call knowledge feudalism and digital economic nationalism. Over the past 30 years, we've thought about, or even longer, we've thought about the international economy in the rough terms of, like, say, free trade versus protectionism. And the assumption has generally been that cross-border flow is good, restrictions bad. All underwritten by the theory of comparative advantage, where trade liberalization can, at least under certain circumstances, be a win-win situation. But trade logic really doesn't fit a world in which the main cross-border flows are knowledge flows. In the knowledge-driven society, the game is to control as much knowledge as possible. And this leads to our two competing but complementary strategies. So on the one, you have the knowledge feudalist strategy, which is followed by countries and companies that already control economically valuable knowledge. And for them, the best strategy is to maximize protection over this knowledge and maximizing the free flows of this protected knowledge. And this control allows them to exercise monopoly control and exert monopoly rents over the actors and countries that require access to this knowledge. And when you realize that new knowledge is created from existing knowledge, the power or the logic of this approach from the knowledge feudalist becomes pretty clear. Now, in today's world, knowledge feudalist strategies are mostly pursued by the United States and US companies, although the EU is also in the game in areas like, think about geographical indicators. The goal for all of this is not to promote growth, it's to extract rents. So this is a key issue in the global political economy, and it's one that is the second strategy of digital economic nationalism is trying to combat, and it's the strategy followed by those who don't have access to knowledge. Digital economic nationalism is a nationalist strategy because often only the state has the capacity to challenge the global dominant knowledge feudalists and to coordinate their own actors to help kind of create a base of economically valuable knowledge. So think about things like sovereign patent funds and national AI strategies. Now, a digital economic nationalist approach when it comes to knowledge is more open in a sense than a knowledge feudalist approach, at least on the country level or the regional level. But at the end, the goal is still the same, which is dominance over and control over knowledge. Now, often digital economic nationalism is interpreted as a form of protectionism, but it's best thought of as a logical reaction to the knowledge protectionist strategies of the knowledge feudalist. So knowledge feudalism, just to kind of reiterate, unlike free trade, it's designed to build walls around knowledge and charge for access. Focusing on free cross-border flows of this knowledge misses the most important fact of who controls the knowledge. So strong protections are essentially protectionist and feudalist when it comes to knowledge. So that's the first implication. The second implication has to do with the nature of the knowledge that's being promoted. And as I said, it's not just about control over knowledge becoming more important, but what type of knowledge is considered most important. And in our world, as I said, that knowledge is commodified knowledge. So both data and intellectual property are examples of what Karl Polanyi would have called a fictitious commodity. Now, fictitious commodities are those things that we treat as if they were produced by the market, but were actually created for some other purpose. So the three big ones that Polanyi focuses on in The Great Transformation, his landmark book, are land, labor, and money. He argued, in a nutshell, that when we forget that, say, land isn't just natural resources to be bought and sold, but is the biosphere that we depend on to live and to survive, as a society, we're going to run into huge problems. And I think that we're kind of running into those right now these days. So that's why we have environmental laws, why we have labor laws. It's why we have bankruptcy laws, to limit the harm from treating human lives and the environment as means to others' end, rather than as ends in and of themselves. So data and IP are fictitious commodity forms of knowledge, things that are produced for an end in and of themselves, but are turned into things that can be bought and sold or used for purposes other than which they were intended. And so this is pretty obvious, I think, when it comes to intellectual property. Think about a vaccine, right? It's designed to protect people from illness, but when it's turned into intellectual property, it can be bought and sold at often extortionate prices that'll definitely benefit the owner of the intellectual property, but it might price a life-saving drug out of the range of people who need this drug to survive. So that's a kind of what happens when you forget that these fictitious commodities are actually something for other purposes. And the same is true with respect to data, as we'll discuss momentarily. Now, recognizing data and IP as Polanyian fictitious commodities, and the policy response becomes clear. Knowledge decommodification, limiting the commodification of knowledge in the first place. So that's the second one. And I'll do one more thing and then turn it over to Natasha. So the third implication of our argument is probably the most important, and I think it was probably, when it comes to writing the book, it was definitely my favorite one to think about and write about. So throughout the book, we illustrate a lot of our arguments with the leitmotif of Google's failed attempt to build a smart neighborhood in Toronto, which is about 90 minutes from where Natasha and I live. It made international headlines, so some of you might have heard about it. But even if not, the important thing to ask here is the question we were left with at the end of the day, watching this happen over a few years, very close to where we live, was who in their right mind would believe that an advertising and search engine company could design and build an entire neighborhood? It's kind of odd when you think about it that way. And we can ask this question in any number of policy areas. It's common knowledge that large tech companies have inserted themselves into every policy field. And crucially, not just as tech support, but as the transformative dominant actors coming up with the ideas about how things should be structured, from health services to education to government services. The list is pretty much is the same as the list of public services and public policy areas out there. Now, The dominance of the knowledge structure is not just about which companies get rich. Power in knowledge also involves power to decide what counts as knowledge, what we refer to in the book as knowledge legitimation. And knowledge legitimation, in this case, it's implying a change in who we consider to be trusted experts. And in this case, expertise is accruing to those actors who are seen to have a power and an ability to collect and analyze digital data. And this is where we come to the new knowledge in the title of the book. So Google, of course, was selected to design and build a smart city because they were seen to understand data. More importantly, the officials, the city and governmental officials who invited Google to the table saw its general technical expertise in data as more important than specialized expertise in urban design. So the new knowledge, in other words, privileges decontextualized data as superior to theory-based scientific knowledge. It privileges technical skill at finding correlations to subject matter skill or even scientific knowledge generally. And this is a new ideology, and it's what José van Dijk calls dataism. The belief that social relations can be reduced to data and that this data need only be analyzed for correlations to create a neutral, superior form of knowledge. And because this knowledge is decontextualized knowledge, it privileges commodified knowledge that can be used against the interests of those who originally produced it or served as the source of this datafied knowledge. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to Natasha.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out to hear about our book. So for my part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about knowledge decommodification. And before that, I just want to spend a little time talking about how states and private companies express what we call private data power. So Blayne talked about the pervasive political and economic and social effects we've seen in this transformation of our economy and our society to a knowledge-driven economy and society. And what we wanted to emphasize in the book is that this is both states and corporate actors that are increasingly expressing power through the capture and the interpretation of data. And when we talk about governments, this is not just authoritarian governments. There's a lot of emphasis in literature that talks about surveillance by authoritarian governments. This is also democratic governments. So we in the book focus on Australia and Australia's robo-debt. We mention the Netherlands and the debt scandal here. And we're interested in looking at both democratic and authoritarian governments. And here governments are using automated data tools to capture and to interpret data, but also to deliver and manage the delivery of public services, everything from correctional services and immigration to the delivery of welfare. And as we all know, if we pay attention to this in the media, that this capture and prediction, especially the prediction of human behavior, is highly flawed and leads to discriminatory decisions, often replicating and intensifying existing patterns of discrimination. So as Blayne talked about, we focus in the book how companies are intensifying their capture and commodification of intellectual property and data. And John Deere here is a great example. John Deere now describes itself as a tech firm. So no longer is it just an agricultural manufacturer, it's also a tech firm that specializes in the capture and commodification of data. And John Deere employs more software engineers than physical design engineers, so those people who actually build the agricultural equipment. And John Deere describes its tractors as mobile sensor suites that continuously stream data and interpret that data. So here we have farmers that are driving their tractors in the fields, the sensors that are on those tractors capturing data that is streaming to John Deere's servers, and John Deere then captures, interprets that data, and sells those recommendations back to farmers for optimal planting. Now, farmers, John Deere says, own the data that are captured by their tractors in their fields. But The value of this data comes in the interpretation, something that individual farmers don't have the skill, the expertise, the time to be able to do. So John Deere then is in a privileged position of being able to interpret, define, and sell commodified agricultural knowledge. And this is structural power in the agricultural economy and in the knowledge economy. Farmers, on the other hand, are in a position of data dependency, with little control over where their farming data goes, who is able to use it, or how that information is used. And so one thing we really emphasize in the book is how companies are increasingly positioning themselves as consequential data governance actors capable of exerting what we call private data power. So in this economy that Blayne talked about, that centers on the capture, the interpretation of power, power resides with those actors that are capable of the mass collection, interpretation, and marketing of recommendations as authoritative. So power in the corporate sense resides with those companies with the claimed ability to make interpretations of data, to produce authoritative knowledge of behavior, mostly human behavior, and events. And they express, companies, the structural power in two ways. So the first is automated data tools to forecast future events, and especially future human behavior. And the second in data-driven standard setting. So in terms of predictions, companies, and we've all seen the headlines, we've all seen the problems that happen here, use automated data tools to draw from large data sets to make forecasts that they claim are precise and accurate. And their claimed ability, we've seen this in areas to determine who would make a good immigrant, right? A good student or a failing student, someone who will be a good credit risk or a bad credit risk. And they market these forecasts as having predictive accuracy, where others, like governments or civil society, are according these forecasts with social and economic legitimacy. And the structural power here is evident in the claims of predictive knowledge. Now, data forecasting is powerful because businesses and governments are acting as if these predictions are accurate, precise, reliable representations of reality. But we know that these claims rest upon shaky foundations of the data accuracy, and it's not, and the precision of the automated data tools, and they're not. For standard setting in the book, we examine tech firms' expansion into the health sector. So here we can think of Amazon, Palantir, Facebook, amongst others that are promising to produce the next generation of diagnostic and treatment tools, as well as tools to manage the delivery of healthcare. And in the book, we focus on Google's DeepMind AI company and Google's acquisition of the Fitbit fitness wearable. So companies like Google and other big data players have the commercial and the technical expertise to amass high-quality, detailed data sets and the tools. And importantly, they control the intellectual property rights pertaining to those data collecting and data interpreting technologies. And as a result, they can make scientific knowledge inaccessible, as Blayne said, or unaffordable to those who need it most. And big tech then reaps the financial benefits of their dominant position in global value chains from their holder or their claimed holding as the right legitimate knowledge, in this case, in healthcare. Now, for a path beyond knowledge commodification, beyond the knowledge feudalism and digital economic nationalism that Blayne talked about, we propose the path of knowledge decommodification. So decommodification draws on Polanyi's concept of fictitious commodities. And here we can understand intellectual property and data as fictitious commodities. Now, the example for intellectual property, we talked about life-saving drugs. We can also think about clean technology that's desperately needed to be distributed around the world if we're to address the climate emergency. We can also think of data as a fictitious commodity. People, for example, use Fitbits to track their nutrition, their exercise, their sleep habits, and this is how Fitbit is intended to be used. But when Fitbit takes the data that the users have provided and provides that to insurance companies, it becomes a fictitious commodity. Insurance companies can then use this data, repurpose this data from its original use, and use it to raise premiums, differentially discriminate against people, or deny healthcare coverage altogether. Now, commodification, too, is not just with market actors, it's also a security issue. So we can think of police using social media data to build networks of social activists and to share that targeting to arrest people. So here we have the repurposing of data from its original context. It's transforming it into a commodity, whether that commodity is a market asset or a security asset for law enforcement or security agencies. Now, restricting knowledge commodification protected by intellectual property would ensure that the knowledge is used for the purpose it was created, such as clean technology, such as life-saving drugs. IP decommodification, then, would require limiting the term, limiting the scope, and the duration of intellectual property rights to make sure that the knowledge is actually used to promote innovation. Data decommodification would require that the data is only used for the purpose it was originally collected, such as people using Fitbit to track their data, their nutrition and exercise. Now, decommodification here requires putting the user's interests ahead of the actor, whether it's a business, a government, or even a civil society group collecting the data. Now, here in the book, we argue for direct government intervention by democratic states to work towards data decommodification. Now, one practical step would be limiting or outright prohibiting the data brokers who buy and sell data, often in a very unregulated way. Another avenue would be limiting or outright prohibiting controversial, harmful data collection practices by private actors. So this would include a ban on the corporate use of facial recognition data, which is highly inaccurate for a number of populations, or restrictions on the collection and commodification of genetic data, a high harm potential. We also need to limit the commodification of non-personal data, such as the farming data I spoke about, which would help counter the power asymmetries that we're seeing between individual farmers and these big agri-data companies like John Deere. Farmers may feel that they have little choice but to enter the data economy to survive commercially. Now, we recognize that calls to decommodify data may seem almost utopian, but that it does seem utopian is the reflection that we live in a commodified, knowledge-driven society. Now, we end the book with a few probably ambitious policy recommendations, and I'll just mention one. We need democratic accountability to move towards knowledge decommodification. In tech circles, there is a strong suspicion of government that ignores tech companies' structural power and often privileges the intervention by civil society. And civil society is excellent for prodding government forward, for gathering momentum, but civil society on its own cannot rule. And here's why we advocate for a strong, democratically accountable state. And governments here need to take some strong steps to restrict the type of personal data that private actors commodify and to take steps towards data decommodification. So Blayne and I are happy to take any and all questions, and I think we're moving now towards our panel. So thank you so much for listening. And I included... Like a good academic, I included some of our sources. So if anyone's interested, we're happy to share the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks so much. To the table. So it's somewhat infuriating when people write so well and speak so well to bring something very complex to something that's so seemingly logical. It's really very impressive. Thanks so much for sharing this with us. And I've been seeing two people making some very many notes that they already had. So I'm very curious what they have to share with us. Joris, would you go ahead? Marta, will you go ahead? Make up your mind.
Okay. So, good evening, and thanks a lot to both Niels for the invitation and to the authors, because I really did enjoy a lot reading the book. And I must say, I'm a lawyer, and I'm not a law and tech person. So for me, I'm always a bit reluctant to engage with data and IP, but I really enjoyed reading the book, and I think it also makes it very accessible to someone that is generally, as I said, a bit intimidated. So I really enjoyed a lot both the public interest take on the knowledge society, knowledge economy, which I think is really an important move that should be made. But also, I think you really managed to strike a good balance between showing the discontinuity and the continuity, in the sense of really showing what is new and really what are the paradigmatic changes in a way introduced by the Knowledge Society, but also without going into the data exceptionalism of this is something that is absolutely unrelatable to everything we've seen so far. And I think the book really threads very well previous discussions to which I could very much relate into this new world in a way. So I think that was really great. I read the book from the perspective of like public law, but I would say a bit at the intersection of constitutional law and science and technology studies. So I looked mostly at the expert governance part and about the knowledge legitimation chapter of the book. So my comments will relate mostly to that part. And I have two main points that I would like to share. And the first relates to how do we allocate the label of experts? So who are the experts, and what does the knowledge society or the knowledge economy does to the role of the expert? And I found really fascinating the way in which you show how the technical expert, the technician, becomes an expert in everything. We have really this disconnection between the subject matter and the label of expert in a way. So this I found really very relatable and also really fascinating in its simplicity in a way. And also the fact that this then disconnects knowledge from its context and from the whole complexity that, I mean, even traditional science struggles to relate to context and complexity, but in a way this new knowledge in a way completely cuts the ties with the context, essentially. And what kind of this brought me to think is also, I mean, the moment the experts we're talking about in this context are experts that are strongly, if not exclusively, located in the private sector. And what does this do to the role of independence in giving the label of expert, in awarding the label of expert in a way? In the sense that if expertise is control over a body of knowledge, it should also be, I mean, again, this is maybe a bit my normative take, but I also see it as a disinterested knowledge in a way, or interested in, committed to the knowledge itself in a way. And I will come back to this in the sense I'm also not pushing for a decontextual view of expertise, but I'm just wondering to what extent, I mean, the private sector pursues its interest that can coincide on or cannot coincide with the public interest. So we have no guarantee that this is the case. And what happens if all the experts or most of the experts we're dealing with in this context are coming from that sector? So we leave aside, in a way, the importance of independence. And I think, and indeed I don't refer to independence as the ivory tower or as an expert that is removed from a context. I do believe very much that experts, as every knowledge production actor, are embedded in a context, are very situated, and also are diverse in their approach to knowledge. And but I mean more the commitment of expertise to excellence and to transparency, essentially, even in this situated and diverse way in which expertise works. And I think that let's say, letting go of the independence as a, let's say, essential characteristic of the expert is, at the end of the day, detrimental for experts themselves, in the sense that we have seen that abandoning a bit this commitment to independence also risks leading to situations like the ones that you show in the book, of people that have technical knowledge but not really knowledge of the technical fields administering vaccines. And this, I mean, unfortunately really rings the bell with a lot of post-truth. And yeah, we know where that goes, unfortunately. So, and I was wondering, what is the margin to bring in to diversify the range of expertise in this field. So how do we bring in alternative sources of expertise that are not just coming from the regulated industry, essentially, and perhaps also not coming from directly government agencies. So what is, in this context, the role of academia, but also of civil society? I'm thinking if there's an equivalent to citizen science, in a way, to create really this epistemic community that I think is much needed in a field that otherwise risks to shift very much into this privatized expertise. And I think this is tricky also not just in the sense of the epistemic quality of the expertise, but also in the sense of the framings that are made through this private, essentially private expertise, in the sense that obviously experts that that pursue a certain type of interest also reinforce certain narratives and end up enjoying a discursive monopoly over certain issues. And what you were mentioning about there is the fact that data commodification is seen also as leading to more security and more prosperity, and its decommodification might threaten prosperity and security. And this really resonates a lot with what we see in the agricultural sector, where, for example, reducing the use of pesticides is seen as a threat to food security, while we know that actually pesticides represent a big risk to the quality of soil and food security in the long run. So I think it's also very important to put forward an alternative narrative of what like data and IP and more generally like knowledge as a decommodified entity can bring to society. And I think the book does really a great job in contributing to these alternative narratives, to those that really see knowledge as necessarily a commodity that can be bought and sold and that clearly pursues specific interests. And I think it's actually, and this kind of my lawyer angle comes in, but I think it's actually very interesting that not only we have a very strong industry self-regulation in this area, and all, as you mentioned, the importance of private standards in this field that is really it's from the start has been a very prominent phenomenon, but also I find it really problematic in a way the role that law plays in these settings, because we have a lot of private lawyers like Katarina Pistor in her Code of Capital that really showed how law encodes a certain economic model through an economic preferences, basically through these seemingly neutral legal mechanisms. And I think public lawyers have been neglecting this a bit. But I think the way in which knowledge is produced in these settings is very much regulated by the law. So who are the experts? How should their knowledge be incorporated in the decision-making process is very much proceduralized. And so how do we as, citizens, but also institutions in a way, allow these procedures to essentially reiterate those biases that are generated in the very at the very source of this knowledge production process in a way. So this I find really important in a way for also lawyers to start looking at these issues from the perspective of how do we proceduralize knowledge legitimation and knowledge production in regulatory settings, because this I think is something that we have been overlooking as a discipline for a long time. And this brings me to the second point, which you make of the need to embed essentially knowledge production and knowledge legitimation in stronger democratic frameworks. And I think this, and indeed as you showed, this is, this democratic embedding is lacking partly because of this private monopoly essentially on knowledge production. I would add also because of the strong influence that the regulated industry exerts over decision-making processes, but also from a more internal in the sense of institutional perspective. I was also wondering how would an alternative, like a more democratic knowledge production, let's say, or control over knowledge look like? And here I see another difficulty or another issue that should probably be included in a broader reflection on this, which is which part, like how would the decision-making process look like in this setting? Because what we often see when it comes to technically complex issues is that within the three branches of the state or the European Union or the institutional setting we're dealing with, it is very often the executive that takes over. And parliaments are generally quite excluded from technically complex decision-making, while at the same time being the most democratically legitimized decision makers in the trias of judiciary, legislative, and executive. And so I'm wondering also how to include this institutional democratic dimension, in the sense that, as you mentioned, of course, civil society can play a role, and participatory democracy can play a role, especially at the local level. The Barcelona case is kind of obviously very telling there. But how does a representative democracy, how could representative democracy through parliaments also contribute to this stronger democratic embedding? So that's a bit my closing point. And yeah, I look forward to discussing further. Thank you. I will.
I can take this one. Yeah. You want me to go ahead first? Yeah. Maybe it's
yes.
Yeah. And I'm in between. A lot of has been said, and then I'm in between that and some well prepared questions from the audience. I think so. Also, like I'll try to keep it relatively short. So I'm Joris van Hoboken. I'm also here at the University of Amsterdam. I am I'm not really in the law and technology. I'm actually in the field of information law, but there's a lot of overlap with the field of law and technology. And I will try to touch on a few things, there's incredible amounts of touch points of like the work that I do and stuff that's in the book. So that's super exciting. And, generally, thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I really enjoyed the book. I've also really enjoyed meeting you this fall and already discussing a bit. What I like in particular is how the book is moving beyond data and algorithms as the kind of central object. Even though data is really central in the book, it is not really about that in the end, in my interpretation of the book. No, it's really trying to move beyond that. It adds this historical dimension, as Martha also said, that is really fantastic. And for me, what's particularly valuable is also adding this structural power dimension. I was not familiar with the work of Susan Strange, and that's really fantastic how that's informing the core argument that you're making. Very enriching. It was also for me. So I want to touch on a few different things. So first, I will just say, so I'm in this field of information law. The field was kind of kicked off by a bunch of professors here at the University of Amsterdam, that's framing the study of information law in the 1980s. And it was kind of looked at like, okay, we look at the production, dissemination, and consumption of information in society and all the rules, the information law, all the rules that relate to that, all the rules that relate to these kind of things. So they managed to, they were maybe unhappy in different departments of the law school, and they found like a way to kind of leave their kind of classic law departments and start this kind of new thing together. They were all men, actually. It's a little bit of an 80s thing, maybe perhaps still. And it's like, so that was the frame. And so because of that, there's a lot of time. I'm struggling a little bit with the knowledge-information distinction that you make in the book. I think a lot, and maybe you've heard that before, that a lot of ways in which what you say is knowledge, maybe others speak about as information. And I think you deal with it quite well, but there is that kind of, I have a bit of an itch whether I kind of like the word knowledge in the way that you ended up using it, even though you're quite precise. And so, and that's partly because of that just kind of contingent historical reason that I ended up in that kind of way of doing research, or that research tradition. But it also has to do with something else, which is that I think a lot of what we see nowadays in the way that technology companies allow, like, I mean, it creates kind of new dynamics and reconfigure, you know, all sorts of like social, economic, and political relations in the world, has to do with something that at its core is like basically like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. You know, so that's not really, I mean, you could say that is knowledge, that like, I mean, you measure really well, like which parts of the spaghetti stick and why is it sticking? What did you do with the sauce? Or, you know, like you can, you know, like, but it's kind of, I mean, you use this term, like the process of capture, and like, and data has a really big role to play in that, like create all these feedback loops to understand how well your like spaghetti gun pointed at the wall or this other kind of direction is performing. You know, but it's a lot in kind of, it's just performance metrics, it's operations in a way. You know, like, so, and there's this other part of knowledge, which is like, I mean, you go to a librarian and you ask the librarian, you know, I'm interested in this kind of topic, you know, would you give me advice on a kind of, you know, of some books? And I mean, I think you would tap into knowledge then, you know, like that's kind of archetypical kind of knowledge for me, and we're seeing that being replaced by very, very different kinds of things. I mean, we have, of course, like we have had the whole kind of search engine introduction that was like playing around with links and data and like trying to kind of give some predictions and estimates. By now we see even like a completely new form of like answering search queries with just, I mean, these kind of generative AI models, which is, I mean, it's hard to call that knowledge. Or there's something very kind of important about making some very sharp distinctions about that. So, I mean, that's one thing that I wanted to touch on. But like, so it connects a little bit to something that to the buckets of strange. So, like, what I maybe would like to understand from you is. To talk a little bit about these relationships that exist, and I mean you touch on that also, and the production side, the financial side, the security side, and the knowledge side, they're interrelated. In the end, like it's really at the knowledge side of things where things are happening. So, but I'm wondering, wondering how much actually is maybe happening in the other areas and in the area of production also in particular, which is kind of what I was trying to get at with the spaghetti thing, you know? So, because maybe that's really not knowledge, it's just production, it's new forms of production, no? And so so data is a new form of expertise, or it's actually just data as a new input for production processes. You could say, I mean, you could say there's some kind of way in which you could say that's expertise, but it's maybe just replacing expertise. I don't know how Susan Strange would deal with that, or how you think about like whether that makes sense to draw this distinction sharply. Or, and then I was like reading, okay, maybe I'm a Marxist, I'm in the production camp, you know, like I'm just thinking in that kind of, that is really actually in the end where the action is, you know, like, so I'm curious to hear you a little bit more about that. So, I mean, in this remark, I'm building a little bit on work that I did with Seda Gurses. We wrote a paper called Privacy After the Agile Turn, and it's actually a paper that tries to respond some years ago to all this discussion, this very decontextualized discussion about data being so important and algorithms being so important. We're just kind of missing a good anchoring. And what we said is we wanted to really look at, you know, what has really changed and what is really happening in the way that information systems are having impact in the world. And what we did in the paper is say, like, we should actually look at the way in which production is being reorganized, production of information systems, production of digital functionality that we enjoy in the world. And that production has transformed in the paper. We talk about 3 paradigmatic shifts. First, we have new agile production methods. So we had like long time ago, we had information systems and software. It was like shrink wrapped. There was really big release parties, you know, when a new software like thing was released in Windows 95. They were all on stage dancing. It was like new software, you know. But now we have this continuous release and updates, and data and stuff is playing a big role in that. And the spaghetti guns come into it a lot too. So
the Marxist spaghetti gun. I'm ready. All right.
The second part is modularity. There's like a way in which like the. No, I mean that's actually not. That's not the second part. The second part is cloud. Like that cloud computing. Like the kind of core infrastructure enabling. For all these new types of services. To live and to exist. And I'm blanking out on the third one now. So sorry for that. Yeah. So anyway, but like in that paper, we talk about we introduced this term capture also, and we're relying there on this work of Phil Haggart, which I want to mention also for the audience. It's like that is just a really fantastic piece. It's called surveillance or capture and it's two different approaches to thinking about privacy issues, and it's really about thinking the capture model is really taking the production of information systems and the logic of that production as a very central departure point. And explaining then that it's really the capture of, the introduction of digital functionality in the world. For that, you need to capture the environment, like the sensors come in, and then you can start to exercise power in that kind of space. So we build on that, and we show how, these new kind of transformations have shifted things a little bit around. So, okay, like I think maybe I need to slowly wrap up. So maybe what I'll do is I'll finish with some remarks on the area of platform regulation, which is an area that I work on quite a bit. So I think in the area of platform regulation, we're seeing a lot of activity of the European Union, also in particular. We see a bunch of like very big new kind of regulatory initiatives that are trying to deal with tech power. And there are basically two main buckets of tech regulation, platform regulation in that space. One of them is dealing with the economic power, with certain what they're called winner-take-all dynamics. It's like just one particular digital company, tech company, taking like the whole market because of network effects and because of certain economic logics. And so what happens is the European Union has moved in and said, we're just going to set some ground rules that prevent these very big kind of like almost monopolies from abusing these new forms of power. So that's on the economic regulation side. But we also have like more on the societal side, especially social media and but also like all sorts of like other kind of market platforms. They produce, tremendous impacts on our society. And, like that is through issues of harmful content and disinformation and issues of like all sorts of problematic kind of dynamics. And maybe companies not doing a terrific job at dealing with those types of issues on their platform. So what Europe did is come in and try to deal with that and try to deal with this new form of power. No? And so I think what we see there is we see, regulation running into this logic where the companies there's some kind of optimization machines. They're in a very particular kind of logic of, making profit in particular ways. And we come with the kind of demand as a society saying like, hey, we need you to actually start caring about some real kind of social issues. And I think we're at this time now where this new regulation is coming into force. We're organizing a big conference next week on the Digital Services Act. That's how it's called. And it's like, and it's in a way at this moment it's kind of a huge clash of logics. In terms of the expectations that you can hold these companies to account, and the companies just trying to find some ways to innovate, but also lean into these enormous information asymmetries, that they have, and like that's like having to do a bunch of like risk assessments and finding ways to, to maybe, just do enough, and for regulators to kind of see like how can we in the end be really successful in making these companies care about these social issues instead of just kind of optimizing and maneuvering their way around it. Okay, so with that, I will maybe end my remarks. Thanks again for having me and for the terrific book.
Thanks so much. Wow, that was a lot. I'm curious what you're going to do with it.
Oh, you want to, okay.
And this is like, you're going to start? Yeah.
Thank you very much for all those comments, and I'll try to be relatively brief and just probably not address all of them. So if there's something you really want to know the answer, say, what about this? And I'll do my best. But I'm going to start with, because it was again one of the fun parts about doing the book was thinking about the distinction between information and knowledge. When I first presented this, I think it was at the University of Bochum. We presented it, and like I said, they didn't like it because I made the mistake of mentioning the word truth, and I should not have done that. Because really, first of all, as I think you noted, in the book we use information and knowledge in technical ways. Like we're saying, this is exactly what we mean, and I think that's kind of fair for especially for an academic text. Like I tried in my own kind of a popular writing, I try to use information and knowledge in the same way, but sometimes information is just, when you're talking to a public audience, it's easier. But I think that the reason, again, when Susan Strange is talking about defining knowledge and the knowledge structure, it's about what is deemed to be legitimate knowledge and socially valuable knowledge. And the example that she starts with is religious knowledge in the European Middle Ages, where the church was seen as the arbiter of knowledge, and the most important knowledge that they had was, how do you get to heaven? And this basically gave them kind of purchase over all of knowledge. And of course, the Reformation and the Enlightenment and all that, and grossly oversimplifying, but that gets pushed off to the side. There's still religious knowledge out there, but it's what she calls state scientific or scientific bureaucratic knowledge becomes the dominant form of knowledge. And so it really doesn't have to do, for Strange and the way that we use it, knowledge doesn't really have to do with like, oh, well, that's scientific knowledge and that, how we learn it. It's what's seen as being legitimate knowledge. So it can be anything. It can be, and this is where I got into trouble with truth. I said something like, for instance, that a dictator or a would-be dictator says, and the followers treat that as truth. That is a form of legitimate knowledge, no matter how offensive it might be to, or how, quote, wrong it might actually be. It's what is seen as being legitimate. And so that's the kind of the dynamic that we were looking at in the book, which is that in the two big examples that we use are smart cities. Like, why would Google be considered to be an expert in this field, and you wouldn't listen to? And that's how they got the job. They hired urban designers, but it was Google that got them in the door. That was one example we used. The other one we used was the various COVID tracking apps, which were designed in deference to Google and Apple's desire to kind of have constant total surveillance, and was designed with strong privacy protections, which a lot of privacy advocates praised. But if you're in the health field during a pandemic, privacy is the absolute last thing you want to have, because you want to have public officials with access to knowing how the disease is spreading, so you can actually stop it. And so the reason that it was designed that way was because it was Apple and Google's kind of imperative. That's what they wanted. So that's what they got. They were the ones that were listened to. So they were seen as the experts. And so it's that kind of change that we were trying to get at in the book. And the other thing I'll say too is with respect to Susan Strange and how the various structures fit together. So they're all. So the way Strange sets it out is that, she would point out, if you're a Marxist, you would say obviously it's production that is the most important thing. If you're an international relations scholar and you're a realist, you're going to say it's all about security. You can't have a community unless you've secured your borders. Finance has been, we've seen how important finance has been over the past 40 years. And if you're a post-structuralist, say it all starts with knowledge, right? It starts with thinking and language and all that. And what Strange says is all these things are important, they're intertwined, but none of them is a priori more important than the other. So what matters is that at certain times, one of them will be more important than the other, and so that logic and that logic will tend to dominate. So if say you're fighting a war, your basically decisions about knowledge, production, and finance, all of them are still important, but they're going to be subsumed to military objectives. With respect to the emerging kind of information imperium state that we talk about, certainly influenced by finance, and essentially the kind of like the low interest rates after the global financial crisis that led all the huge swaths of money going into the tech sector with wonderful results. At the same time, too, though, it's been influenced by the security structure. Again, post 9/11, in the United States, it's like, oh, we've got to basically keep everybody safe. We're going to have to watch everything, and so that's how. And so that kind of those two kind of things feed on each other. And Sean Powers and Michael Jablonski call this the information industrial complex. With respect to production, yeah, some of those good examples too. The other one I'd add is like what we talk about in the book, global value chains. We switched from a world of international trade, where trade is seen as being between separate companies in different countries, and that's like when the WTO comes online in the mid-90s. That was the model. But now we're in a world of these global value chains where everything is kind of spread and it's controlled by intellectual property. So that's one big example of how the economy has been and production itself has been transformed. But they feed on it, and as a researcher, Strange would argue, our job is to not assume that one is more important than the other, but to investigate the relationships between them and also who is exerting the structural power, whether it's private or public character. So I'll leave that there. I don't know, Natasha, do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to make just a quick point or two, and then we can go to the audience for questions. So kind of reflecting on both of your questions, and this goes to who do we consider experts and what kind of knowledge do we consider expertise? And when we think about some of the claims that the big data companies, and I can use John Deere as an example, make, they claim that their farming knowledge is, global, detailed, perfect. And when you really drill down, though, this is certain forms of knowledge, right? They're interested in, say, industrial agriculture. They're interested in the top 5, 8 food crops. So there's whole swaths of area of farming, agricultural activity that is just off the map. There's whole areas of the globe where John Deere doesn't see a commercial interest, so it's just uncharted. So part of this is trying to really evaluate where is this interest in data and on what topics specifically, and to really interrogate obviously these companies and their claims of perfect objective knowledge of an entire sector like farming. And an example I always come back to, Fitbit, and I'm of course very critical of Fitbit. Fitbit for the longest time didn't track pregnancy, right? It didn't identify pregnancy as a specific human condition because it didn't see it as commercially valuable, right? So pregnant users of Fitbit couldn't track their nutritional intake, couldn't track their weight gain, couldn't track their exercise because it didn't recognize pregnancy. So here we have the coders, mostly men, who didn't recognize or value pregnancy as commercial. So when you talk about knowledge production, this was a hugely inaccurate mapping of human bodies because pregnancy wasn't included. So, part of this is pushing back about these tech companies, but part of this, like Blayne was saying, this idea of knowledge legitimation is this data collection is always partial, right? It's always shaped by certain ideas and norms and values of what is commercially interesting and valuable. And Fitbit took a long time and a lot of pressure before it started actually including pregnancy and then seeing it as commercially valuable. So yeah, I just wanted to make those points, and I don't know how we're going to go to the audience.
I'm also very excited to see how we're going to do that. So let's see how many people came up with the question that's about one sentence and it goes up in the end and has a question mark. So I see 3, 4, yes. So let's take 4 and see where it goes. We start with the gentleman here in the front.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. It was mentioned that new knowledge differs from contextual expertise in that it lacks theory. Do you think that that's a drawback of the current technology, or do you think that's inherent to data collection and analysis? For example, do you think that for example, with neural networks that will only be able to use those to set standards and make forecasts? Or do you think that in the future we might be able to analyze those to generate theory so that data analysis might liken more to contextual expertise?
Yeah, it's on. There we go. All right. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think where we landed on in the book is it's an ideology. I mean, the problem isn't with the technologies. It's not necessarily even with surveillance as a thing. It's the idea that data itself and correlations, which is what all this is based on only, can basically is the same as theory-grounded scientific knowledge, where the idea comes first. I mean, behind all these things are basically people's and computer scientists and technologists' unacknowledged theories of the world and how the world works, what data is important, because you can never, that's the thing, is you can never collect all the data. There's always a different way to look at things. You're limited by your senses, you're limited by your equipment, you're limited by your ideas about what you should look for. So to think that you can generate theory out of that, no, you can't. I would say that's not to say you can't generate knowledge, because what we're arguing is that's a different form of knowledge. It's not scientific knowledge. It's not based in that. And so that's where you run into the problem, the assumption that by having this data, by having neutral data, which again is an impossibility, you can actually kind of create knowledge. And again, it's not saying that neural networks or any of these things can't do really interesting things or that they can't be used in different ways. But again, it's about according the expertise do you accord it to the technologist, or do you accord it to the person who actually understands how the brain works, for example?
That was a perfect example of a question. Thank you.
You said in your comments and also in your book regarding the contact tracing apps that the app avoided the creation of a centralized database that could also be used to discover patterns in the disease's spread. You didn't provide a citation for this. Aren't you falling into exactly the same trap you outline, that phones designed for Bluetooth, designed for commercial purposes, advertising, and so on, can quite magically create insights that were not backed up by public health researchers, who that there are insights to be mined from these exact technologies that would help diseases spread and help tackle human issues.
Could you repeat? I don't quite I had trouble following.
You assume that the creation of a centralized database would be a useful form of knowledge, and you don't cite it at all. As someone, I was involved in the development of the technology that Apple and Google later adopted with public health authority officials and researchers. There's no evidence of that. It was hugely speculative, and it's just interesting. I'm just wondering, are you not falling into exactly the same trap that you say companies are leading the way with legitimate forms of knowledge?
The citation we had we did have a citation on that. The citation was Tamer Saron's work, which talked basically about how epidemiology has been traditionally practiced. So,
but not with a centralized Bluetooth database that's never been used ever.
That's a ridiculous thing, because this hasn't been done before. So there's no evidence that the centralized Bluetooth database, but there's evidence that the central collection of data and the sharing of data by governments has worked, because that's how epidemiology works. I mean, to claim that a technology that, like Bluetooth, that didn't exist in the 1950s wasn't used to basically deal with a disease in the 1950s is kind of absurd.
That's not my claim, so I don't want to go into the discussion is being intensely involved for years in this. Epidemiologists, digital epidemiologists as well, that we are working with day in, day out would say, that's a nice research project. We have literally no reason to believe that will be useful for disease fighting, the centralized database. That's I think and that's why I'm asking, are you not falling in the same trap by imagining, and Tamer Saron is not an epidemiologist, and she will be the first to admit that, imagining that this database would be useful and legitimizing the form of knowledge that you critique is being created?
I think I think the larger point we were trying to make is that Google and Apple, together with mostly tech people or privacy people in various countries, this was certainly Canada's situation, were making the decisions rather than public health people. So these COVID notification apps or tracing apps were largely tech first and public health second. So could the Canadian health system and our public health officials track the disease better through these apps? And the answer has been no. And certainly the answer has been no, according to the US GAO as well, looking at some of these. So on your point of centralized versus non-centralized, not my area of expertise. We were trying to make the larger point that it was tech companies and technologists driving the creation of the digital response to this, where these were really public health questions. And so better knowledge of how the disease was spreading and who had it and intensification are public health questions that should have been at the forefront of this.
Yeah, maybe I want to react. So followed also some of this discussion, mostly second-hand, but close by second-hand. And I think what stands out for me is also, how Google and Apple were positioning themselves precisely at this moment to move very forcefully into the health space, into the public health space, and to reconfigure relationships there. So I think there was an attempt by Google and Apple to think this through and to say, hey, there's like a way in which our infrastructure could offer some kind of new solution, some kind of new data thing, and we're going to serve this sector. So it seems a little bit counterintuitive to me that, they were definitely doing a lot of that in very close conversation with public health professionals and seeing how they could actually enter into that space. It's of course, the health space is hugely profitable, and being in those types of operations, being centrally involved, it's that was a very interesting opportunity at the time. So it's and they were doing that partly, they were doing that in a way that, the only way they could do that legitimately is to do it in a way that was privacy preserving, because otherwise, even though I have some sympathy also for the idea that there should maybe be more public data, there should be more databases, and there should be more trust in doing things with governments. Our societies are not going to accept those kinds of solutions. So in that, I think Apple and Google were threading a very interesting kind of balance exercise and using their infrastructural power in the process.
1, 2, 3, and let's take a couple together. So let's start in the left back, the lady with the colored scarf.
Thank you. Could you say a bit more about this very core idea in terms of what you recommend, which is to maintain the purpose, the original purpose for which data was collected? So that's one of the core measures that you recommend. Could you say a bit more about how you would determine this, especially in the context of, big data where traces that are maybe not data in the first place end up being interesting? So how do you capture this? How do you enforce that?
Natasha, I was wondering, at the end of your presentation, you mentioned we need more democratically accountable governance, something like this. I was wondering if you could expand on this and how this would change the knowledge economy.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a hand here in front.
Who wants it?
Oh, yes, here, the gentleman here, please.
Where is it?
Did I also see a little hand there? No? Okay.
Thank you for mentioning this so-called smart project in Toronto and exposing some power-hungry parties, both in government and in big companies. My question is, should we refrain from using the word smart when it's actually not smart at all for citizens, normal people, to engage in this sort of project.
Excellent. So I'll take the first two questions. And certainly in terms of data decommodification, how do we limit this commodification? How do we ensure data is only used for the purpose it was collected? It almost feels too late to do this. It almost feels utopian to even make this statement. But we have these terms of service agreements. We have governments that are interested in regulating or curbing things like the use of facial recognition technology. So part of this would be hopefully legislation that would say things, some data can't be passed on to data brokers, that some data can't be passed on to marketers. If we think of things like fertility apps, right, serve a very useful purpose for people to monitor their fertility, monitor their menstrual cycles, but this data is passed on to marketers, which the user may not want, but the user may want to have their data shared in an anonymized, aggregated fashion with health researchers for, actual health research into this area. Maybe not with for-profit pharmaceutical firms, but maybe for health research. So part of this is, I think, really pulling apart some of these, the data broker cycles and figuring out where consumers want their data or feel comfortable with their data to go, and also the harm of this, right? We've and largely to do with the big tech companies, but also in this kind of, unregulated data broker industry, we've accepted as unchangeable that data will just flow out of people, and then third parties, whether they're marketers, security companies, governments, God knows where, or data brokers, will just use this for their own ends. And we can change this, right? There have been laws restricting this, so this is possible, but it'll be obviously very difficult. For the second question about democratic government control, this is often seen as, again, utopian or invoking Big Brother, but civil society can only go so far. And for what we've seen just in relation to, say, the big social media firms, civil society groups, small tech civil society groups basically beg Meta, beg Twitter, beg YouTube to stop exploiting children, to stop hate speech, to curb violent extremists on their network, and they get nowhere. Right? We've gotten nowhere with special pleading and begging these companies to act as good corporate citizens. And I think this goes back to your statement. No, I don't think they have any social interests. And no, I don't think we can beg them or cajole them to be good corporate citizens. They have to be, I don't know what else they can do to prove to us that they are terrible, exploitative corporate citizens, and that they have to be directly and punitively regulated. So when I talk about direct democratic control, I'm encouraging governments like Canada, like the European Union, to take strong steps. And this goes back to Marta's discussion. This has to be for citizens of those countries. And I know many people here are probably European and feel positive about the GDPR, but for countries that the GDPR applies to, like Canada, we didn't have a say in that. And we would like to have a democratic say in laws that apply to businesses and to entities in our country. So when we talk about democratic processes, this is part of it. I know the European Union had the best of intentions and feels that this is a progressive, useful, groundbreaking privacy regulation that applies globally. But for those of us who it is applied to us without our permission and without our input, it's a form of neocolonialism. And so we would like to push back and create our own laws. So that's also what we mean by democratic control and democratic accountability.
Sorry, what was the last question again?
Smart cities.
Oh, smart cities.
There's a perversion of smart.
Yeah.
We shouldn't call it smart.
Yeah, it's just the latest in terms that have been applied to kind of like the most progressive or the most now forms of urban development. So yeah, no, it's mostly a marketing thing. And interestingly enough, very soon after like Sidewalk Labs, Google started trying to do working with Waterfront Toronto in Toronto, they dropped smart city completely from the lexicon. So yeah. And just one last thing to go back to what you were saying at the beginning, or asking about the beginning, is about is about the democratic, how to make these things more democratic. And one of the big things, at least in Canada, is a lack of governmental capacity to do work on these things. And so we often, like Natasha was just saying, some a little bit harsh things about the GDPR, but at the same time too, like oftentimes, being Canadians, we look at Europe and the European Union and say, oh man, at least they're doing stuff. And like, Nils, you've told me about projects that the University of Amsterdam is working on with respect on basically capacity building and in these areas, and it's really kind of it's actually inspiring. But I think it's again coming from Canada where we don't really have any capacity to in government to think about these things. That's kind of where it actually begins. It's because you're right that different actors have different interests. We shouldn't expect for-profit companies to work in the public interest. Sometimes they will, but it's not their job. And so, but the first step, at least for a country like Canada, is to actually build the capacity to actually understand what the hell's going on, and that's really not the case here. And I'm sure it can be beefed up everywhere, but definitely back home.
Can definitely guarantee you we also have no idea what's going on, even though we will pretend we do. On that note, I'm not going to give you a final words because we already have shared lots of stuff this evening. I'm very thankful to you all. If you want to think more about smartness, I can definitely recommend the book The Smartness Mandate by Orit Halpern and Robert Mitchell. It also goes into this, and we hope to have Orit here in a talk sometime soon. If you prefer to digest your knowledge in podcast form, I can definitely recommend Gustav Bessem's Stuurloos, which also really talks about knowledge and practices within government. And in that series, definitely the one with Bert Hubert is really touching upon this topic. Of course, I would also definitely like you to get into interactive stance, because knowledge production is a communal process. So there are 2 reading groups of the Critical Infrastructure Lab that you can join. One on infrastructures and one on sustainability and infrastructures. You can find more information about those at criticalinfralab.net. And now I'd like to thank you all to put your hands together for our guests from Canada and our local heroes. And thanks so much for excellent questions and our free drinks later on. Thanks so much. Cheerio all.